We're really happy to be here. My name is Emil Kvarnhammar. This is Marcus Murray. And really glad to see this many people joining us today. This is the first time we have a full security day here at Oredev. So,
Yay! No, it's kind of funny. I remember being on stage. It was maybe, I think 10 years ago. It was an MSDN summit in Stockholm, which is at the time was a fairly big Microsoft event for developers. And I was asked up on stage for 2 minutes in the beginning of the day to promote a security day that was going to be taking place later. So I asked the audience, and it was approximately 550 people in there, and I asked, how many of you guys are interested in security? Raise your hands. And I had like 3 hands in the air. And it was kind of funny because to me, I had to find a snappy comeback for that because it was kind of embarrassing. Like, am I going to try to sell this to 3 guys? So I was like, this is the problem right here. You're developing code and you're not interested in security. So from that perspective, it's a major breakthrough that we have 83 attendees here that want to invest a day in security from the developer perspective. And this day is going to start from the 3,000 feet level. We're going to talk a little bit about the changes in the world in regards to legislations and the Snowden effect and all that stuff. And then we're going to drill down to a really technical day where we're going to expose hacker techniques used to break into your applications, the ones that you develop. We're going to talk about other things like, for example, to play you in here.
well, we're going to talk about development in several different contexts. I mean, I bet some of you, how many of you are web developers?
Yay.
I thought so, quite a few. So we're going to talk a lot about web development. We're going to talk about development of web services, for instance. REST is extremely popular. We're going to discuss about that. Of course, we're going to talk about mobile development. How many of you are Android developers? Not that many. So iOS developers? Yeah, quite a few. So we're going to talk something about mobile platforms, or quite a lot about mobile platforms. However, I would say in general, whether it's web development or if it's mobile development we're talking about, most of the concepts are common. So the most important is, or the most important takeaway that I hope you'll get out of this day is thinking security in all your development. You probably do already, at least some of you, but that's really the important takeaway. And I bet there are, even if you're really, really interested in security, I hope there are things you'll see here today that you didn't know about before.
And we know there will be something, right?
Yeah,
of course.
So we're going to show hacking demos, as Marcus mentioned, both how operating systems are getting hacked, how middleware gets hacked, how build systems are being hacked, how your own code could get hacked, depending on how secure it is.
Yeah, and it could also be good to introduce ourselves a little bit, and it's going to also be a reflection of the guys that are going to talk here today. Most of the people presenting are from the TrueSec company, and everybody who's going to be on stage, there's one external speaker from our TrueSec perspective.
Yeah, Joshua Corman, is he here?
Yeah,
there he is. Welcome, Joshua. Really glad.
That's the main event right there. So if you ever watch UFC, that's the fighter right there.
We're really happy to have you here joining us today. Should we start with our session?
Yeah, I just had one thing to say in regards to that. Everybody will be on stage. They're hardcore penetration testers, reverse engineers, secure coding programmers full time. So this is not a side thing they do just to show you something they're interested in. This is what they do every day. So they're going to transfer their knowledge from their everyday work to you guys who maybe do other things mainly and are interested in this area. So it's a transfer of knowledge, basically. But it's the stuff that they see in their everyday job. It's not just something they read about.
So coding in a world of cybercrime, cyber threats, and espionage.
Yeah, this is the holistic 3000 session, the keynote to start with, just to give you an idea what's going on in the world.
So, and this is really Marcus' area of expertise. So, but I think we'll split it up somehow. But Marcus, I think you should talk a little bit about the Snowden effect and Snowden in general, what it means. What does it mean for developers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of interesting. How many of you guys have read any of the documents that has been published after the Snowden disclosure? It's fairly many. I mean, looking at them, it's really interesting to see the efforts and money that is invested in compromising the internet, basically. I mean, in some of the Snowden documents, for example, the Bull Run document, they talk about, for example, kleptography, how government agencies invest money in making protocols weaker. So, for example, they gave the NSA organization $10 million just to implement a weak algorithm into one of their products as the default algorithm, so that companies using that algorithm could easily be disclosing their data whenever you, as the government agency, wanted to access it. So I think it's a new and scary world, and we're going to talk a lot about how the Snowden effect actually affects the European Union, and what's happening with us as individuals, and the steps that the European Union is taking to prevent future problems like this. But an interesting thing with the Snowden documents is that most of them are from the time between 2008 and 2000, maybe the newest ones were from 2013. And even looking back in that time, you can see that they had fairly strong powers to do things on computers. And you can only imagine what they can do today. There are hundreds and hundreds of $millions invested in this technology to conquer computers and identities on an everyday basis. We're going to do some slides and talk about that. One example is the treasure map. I don't know if you heard about it, but the treasure map is actually an application that is used by agents in the NSA and other organizations actually as well. It is a console application and a web interface, so they can actually log on and just access the treasure map. And the treasure map glues together everything that the NSA and everybody knew before, the geographical side of the world. I mean, they map the world. They know they probably know more about the Swedish waters than we do. And of course, they know everything about individuals. They track people, and they know which people are the citizens of different nations. They can buy that information. But this is about the logical layer, as they call it. And the logical layer for them in treasure map is to identify every router, every host, every user on the entire internet, and then map that to geographical locations and the real physical individuals behind. And the goal is to be able to do that in real time, so they have an exact copy of the layout of the internet. They're not going to have a copy of every document or everything, but every router, every computer, everything that is moving as an entity. And when it comes to collect information about you, they're going to try to get as much as they ever can. That is the goal. And one example, if you take the treasure map, if you look at the application, you can, for example, if you can log on and have a higher cred, then you're allowed to access, for example, the Jolly Roger data. So you can put the Jolly Roger metadata in it, and the Jolly Roger program is actually known, exploited, owned Windows hosts that they can compromise at any day when they want to, because they are being compromised by the TAO unit, the Tailor Advanced Organization unit. So they do tailored attacks. Actually, I got that a little bit wrong. Doesn't matter. But it's tailored. TAO, Tailored Advanced Operations Units. That's what it is. Yeah, so that unit, they have a way to do man-in-the-middle attacks, and they know exactly which browsers are vulnerable on which computers. So whenever you surf to, for example, LinkedIn, if you pass through one of their jump stations or one of their probes, then they will take you to LinkedIn, but they will also take you to another page where they will run a client-side exploit and compromise your browser and then compromise your computer. And they do that automatically. They also have a layer where they can see all the VPN access points, and they have brute force attacks, and they have different vulnerabilities in VPN protocols to break into those. So they do this mapping in order to be able to break into systems and steal data. And you can see in the Snowden documents that they have, even back in the days, because these documents are kind of outdated, they have implemented vulnerabilities in firmware on hard drives. They have implemented, actually, there are 3 different versions of Dell computers that has vulnerabilities in it, so that whenever that computer is running, they would be able to compromise it because of firmware. Yes? Yes, I mean, the Snowden document talks about the NSA specifically, but you're right, it's a very good question. Is that the only bad organization in the world that is threatening us? Absolutely not. We have, I'm not going to say that we have the same capabilities in Sweden, but we have capabilities in Sweden as well, in every country. I do believe that in Sweden, I mean, I know some of the stuff going on in Sweden because we actually have on our team the bureau director of the FRA employed in our organization. He's not there anymore, but he's not allowed to disclose anything, but you can read something getting to know a guy. But he says in Sweden we made a decision back in the days whether or not we should break into computers in order to fulfill our need to get data. We don't actively break into computers in Sweden. That's at least what he's telling me. So different countries have different morals, if you will. And I'm not saying that could have changed since he left. I don't know. He left a couple of years ago. But there are some different standards. But they all have capabilities because in case of war, they're going to hit bottoms. They know. They're all mapping the internet. They're all fighting to find zero days and vulnerabilities in code so that they can, whenever needed, break into systems. We made you cheerful. You all look so happy now.
So should we talk about the European Union? Of course, the world reacted on the Snowden, or as part of the Snowden effect, so to say. I think that there's been quite a lot of activity in the European Union even before Snowden, but after that, of course, this has been higher on the agenda. And one good example of that is the General Data Protection Regulation. So what does this mean? It's, or the purpose with this is to unify everything about data protection within the European Union, or actually about citizens of the European Union and protecting their personal data.
Yeah, I'll give you an example of that. Not too long ago, a Swiss law student, it's an Austrian law student. He wanted to know how much this social network, I'm not going to mention it, but you can probably figure it out, a very popular social network, how much information is stored about him. So he sent them an email and told them he's a law student and he required to obtain that information because he could find support in the law that he has the right to it. Because there is actually law from 95 that is fairly strong that helps us, even today, before this new directive is going to come into play in 2017. Anyhow, he received 1,224 pages of information about himself. Reading through it, he realized that most of that data is stuff that he deleted. And problems like that is why this new legislation is needed. And as of today, the thing with unified data is that we have, I don't know exactly how many countries are in the EU, is it 31, I think? I could be wrong here. If somebody knows, they can raise their hand and be proud, and they can tell everybody they know more than me about the EU. But anyhow, they all have different laws. It's not unified. So the problem is that you need to understand as a citizen what's going to happen if I store my data in country A or B. Another issue is actually for the companies themselves, is you have a popular website and you're developing code, and that is published, or you have different sites addressing different countries. Maybe you need to understand the differences in 25 different legal systems. and apply your laws so that they fit them all, or they're different for every country. So it's all going to be unified. We're all going to have to deliver under one single law. Also, a new thing with this is that if you have a multinational business, you will only need to address the government agencies or fulfill the law in your particular country. It's going to be the same law, but you only need to deal with one authority, the one in your country where you have your main organization. It's going to be way easier.
So this means a lot of both technical and organizational requirements for you as a company or as an organization. So one example of such a requirement is that the users are going to be required to be notified, you are going to be required to notify your users about a data breach within 24 hours after you discovered it.
Yes, and also every country is going to have one authority that is going to be responsible for this. So whenever you have a breach in your organization, that could imply that personal identity data has been stolen, and that's a wide term. That could be your address or whatever. It doesn't have to be your social security number or your credit card. Then you will have to notify the authority and, where applicable, customers. And that's a major impact, because that's going to change things, especially in Sweden, where I guess most of you guys live, because right now you don't have to report. And you know what's the problem with that? Nobody knows what's going on. There's no statistics. We have no idea. So there is something good coming out of this. We're going to understand how big the cybersecurity problem is and how many companies are breached. It's kind of funny when you read the papers in the US and there are corporations breached every day. In Sweden, it seldom happens. Well, it really happens. We have full-time employees doing investigations from intrusions. It's just never being reported. Questions? Why not? This is a full day. We can play with this. We're just a small group of people. A question. Here we go.
Do the requirements include the ability to detect breaches as well?
That is a very good question, actually. This is a new directive that is not formed down to details yet. It's going to be done in 2016. But there is going to be details about the level of security you need to have in your organization in order to fulfill a requirement. So my assumption would absolutely be that you're going to have that. You're going to be able to detect it. You have to be preventive. You need to have a certain level of security. You actually need to have documentation on how you implement security, and you need to live by it.
Exactly, and that's a good way of explaining it is looking at what's being considered as a violation of these laws or this law. So, for instance, if you can't prove that you're compliant, that's actually a violation. The way it looks right now, at least. So, and if you're not informing your users, of course, clearly that's a breach. And also, I mean, and this partly involves the right to be forgotten, but right to be forgotten is now probably going to be called the right to be erased or right to erasure, because it's quite complex to actually be forgotten on the internet. So, but at least you'll have some kind of right to get your personal data erased from each of these services.
Actually, if you Google today, you can see in the bottom bar of Google that there is a button there if you want to opt out of Google. And you can be kind of, and this is because of a ruling not too long ago. So you can actually say, you don't have to say I opt out, you can say I don't want to be searchable being on those websites. So you can be fairly granular. The scary thing, being smart people as you all are, I can imagine because you all came here, so you have to be smart, is that the only thing you need to send in order to prove your identity is a document with your name on it that is like an ID document. And you can imagine that Google won't have 5 hours per person who want to opt out. So if you hate somebody, there could be a backlash to that effect, right? You may take that famous speaker and make him opt out of Google. and nobody will ever find them again. So I mean, there are side effects that we need to consider here. It's kind of interesting, right? Thinking
That's a
about
good
it.
example of lack of secure authentication, I think.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
we're going to
maybe
talk
so.
more about that later today. So just so that this will have some kind of effect, there are actually going to be fines up to 5% of your annual turnover within the company, within the global company.
Yeah.
That could mean quite a lot of money.
Yeah, and that will affect you as developers. Now, I'm not saying you should be scared, but you should look at it this way. There's going to be a room for talking to management about we need to enforce security controls. Because if I create an application and somebody can from the internet extract user data because there was a file upload, SQL injection, whatever vulnerability, you can be fined. So they need to give you time to implement security controls. It needs to be a part of the process in implementing new products, applications, OSs, or whatever. Because this is a big number. This is management talk. And that's new. We never had that. This is a tool that you can use and that we need to talk about. This is why we do this as a keynote, because this is going to be a big discussion over the next year. We just want to give it to you early. It starts now.
Question?
Talk about this. Yes?
This legislation, will it only apply to commercial entities and also to government?
I mean, you're asking the best questions ever. I know the answer, but it's a hard one because as of right now, it's stated that it's going to affect corporations and organizations. And I think the government side of it is not really laid out yet, because that's the most difficult discussion. You know, how are governments going to be treated, and it's going to be decided by governments or government agencies. So that's the challenge right now there. What rules should I put on myself? So corporations is going to be first step out. There's going to be something, but how do you find a government agency? You take money from itself and give it to itself. It's just a different challenge. But of course, they're going to be included. Another thing that's good to know is it's not just going to be for EU countries. It's going to be for anybody who sells stuff to the EU. So if you're an American-based organization and you promote your web services or whatever to European citizens, you're going to be illegal. So whenever you enter European space, they're going to want to talk to you if you break those rules, even on US land or Asian land or African land or whatever. So this applies to protect European citizens from everything that is exposing their identities. But this is the way to enforce it, money.
So if we should get slightly more into the hands-on exercises of today, because this is really going to be a hands-on day. We're going to talk a lot about hacking and especially what you can do as developers to improve the security. But one important part of development or secure development is understanding your enemy. So we need to understand, and that's part of the reasons why we show hacking demos, except that it's cool, of course. It's quite fun to see on stage too, but it's extremely important to understand how the attacks are performed. How does these attackers operate? And of course, there are most of the time everything is about executing code on a target system. But it might also be that executing code is not that interesting. Could be just enough to get hold of the data, the personal data that we talked about about the European Union. Credentials, of course. So we as developers need to ask ourselves, how could attackers possibly get hold of credentials in our system? Could that be extracted from the server somehow? Could they get it from the user's devices? If it's stored somehow in a keychain or something like that? From backup data of the device? So things like that is stuff that's going to be extremely important in the future to improve the security of our system.
Yeah, and it's also about fighting the fact that people are naive sometimes. I don't know if you know this, but Emil, for example, he disclosed or responsibly disclosed a little bit of information about a local privilege escalation vulnerability found in Mac just 2 weeks ago. And he called it root pipe, if you want to Google it or whatever. I think you're going to show it today, maybe.
Yeah, we're going to show it today.
Yeah.
Later.
But anyhow, it's funny reading the comments on the newspapers, especially the IDG newspaper in Sweden. Like, no. He is probably root already in order to become root. This is lame. It's like some people can't imagine that there could possibly be a local privilege escalation in a Mac. No, that's back in the days. That can't happen anymore. It's just not possible. Of course, it's code written by developers. Somebody took a shortcut. And it's going to tell you the details about it. Maybe not today, but as soon as we can responsibly disclose it in 50 more days.
I mean, that's really an important point, because I guess you, as developers, of course, you know that already. It's not that a specific company have twice as good developers as the other company. I mean, of course, there are good developers and not that good developers. Of course, that's the case. But I mean, if you look at large corporations as a whole, for instance, Google, Apple, Microsoft, they're not that different. It's not that Apple engineers are a lot more security conscious than anyone else. Could be, but I don't think that's the case. It's more about marketing, how you market your products, whether they're marketed as being secure or if they're marketed as being open and flexible and everything.
Yeah, last time we did a pen test on an Oracle product, it was actually the Sun Enterprise One web server. We found 3 zero-day vulnerabilities. And that's pretty fun since it's they have the unbreakable theme to go with Oracle. And we reported it because that was a pen test for a bank, so we reported it through their channels because they own the IP of the report. But they actually only patched 2 of the vulnerabilities. One was by design, so we still have 1 opportunity to break into the service, and that's 1 year ago or more since we did that test.
So where were we?
We're wasting. No, we're not wasting. We can't stop ourselves from speaking, but it's fun.
Yeah.
Let's work through this.
I think we're quite on track still.
Oh, we are. Good.
So about networks and attackers, the traditional network model looks something like this, right? Where we have the attacker on the outside. We have a firewall protecting everything that's within our company. All the servers, at least, well, the servers might be on a DMZ, but I mean, the internal servers, all the internal network infrastructure, all the clients, of course, that might not be patched at all, but they're still protected with the firewall. That's not the case anymore, right? This model is totally obsolete. Because nowadays, clients and servers are everywhere. Servers might be in the Amazon cloud or Microsoft cloud or even smaller companies producing cloud services to you. Clients are being connected to any network, anywhere. And of course, the attackers are everywhere. We must see the attackers as someone being everywhere. So the firewall, I wouldn't say it's useless, but it doesn't serve the same purpose as it used to be. I think this is really important to remember. We're going to see more examples later today where this is a really big issue. And this is something we need to keep in mind the whole time.
Yeah, we can't rely on something in between when we develop internet-facing applications or mobile applications. We need to realize that we may be the last security boundary. That's different.
And just to be clear, I'm not saying that having your server applications or server infrastructure in Amazon or Azure is a bad thing. it could actually mean that you have a lot better security than you used to have when you had it in your internal network. So the important thing to understand is that the picture is a lot more complex today.
Yeah. And Emil, I need to remind you, I want to copy this. I want to have this as my desktop background. That's the particular one. That's, sorry.
Okay. You can have whatever desktop background you like.
Oh, a picture of your wife? Or? Yeah.
Maybe not.
That was funny to everybody but you, my friend. So anyhow.
So some of the larger breaches this year, that's also quite fun or quite interesting to look at. Something that's quite fun is the iCloud breach. It's fun because it got so much media attention just from the fact that it was celebrity photos, private celebrity photos being leaked. So I don't think the interesting part of this is celebrity photos.
You don't?
I think it's more interesting to understand how much attention this got, and we need to ask ourselves the question: how long was this known by attackers before everything about this was revealed, before it was used to extract celebrity photos? This could have been known for quite some time.
It's also interesting to talk about what defines a vulnerability. I mean, they had an authentication model that worked. You had to enter your username and password. It just allowed brute force attacks. How often doesn't a web application allow you to enter an infinite number of user attempt or login attempts? That's not necessarily a vulnerability. It becomes a vulnerability because this is Apple. So you can just use email addresses and random passwords. So you can try, every email address you could ever harvest, and then you can try 15 simple passwords. So the size itself turns it vulnerable. It wouldn't be too easy if there was one user and you don't know the username. Not that a username should ever be like a secret, but again, the fact that you put it on the cloud or make it's a popular service will actually expose it and make it more look like a vulnerability just by implementing something that is fairly weak.
And the reason we can question whether this could have been known for quite some time is that this totally depends on the level of audit in that web service. I mean, if worst case scenario is that there wasn't any logging or intrusion detection systems at all on that web service. And of course, then brute forcing could have gone on for quite some time before being detected. And that's something that's really important. Maybe not something that's directly going to affect you as a developer, but it's going to affect you and your organization as a whole when you deploy your service. So we need to make sure that we have the right mechanisms in place to detect intrusions. One of the interesting intrusions or breaches this year was community health systems. They run hospitals in the US. 207 hospitals is the last figure I got. This affected 4.5 million patients. And the reason why I think this is so interesting is that they probably could have had their web applications, their clients and everything patched 100%. But just by forgetting one single part of their network infrastructure, a Juniper device, which hadn't been patched for the Heartbleed vulnerability.
Speaking of that, one of the TAO targets of the NSA is actually Juniper firewalls. They have 2-3 different models that they, by design, can break into and use as jump stations into internal networks. It's documented in the Snowden documents. It's not something I'm saying. You can look it up.
There has been speculations that this was an attack being performed from China, but I don't think that really matters because the way the world looks right now, I mean, anyone could get hold of computers somewhere on the internet. So you could as well perform an attack from the US to the US through China or something like that. No one knows about that. Another example is JP Morgan Chase. They initially thought, or they initially stated that it was about 1 million accounts being affected by this breach. That wasn't really the case. It was a bit more serious. It was 76 million households and several small businesses being affected too. And they're spending quite a lot of money on security. They take security extremely seriously. After this breach, they're considering even doubling that budget. So $500 million US.
And the only thing they wish is that they double it the year before.
It's not necessarily going to be improved security just because you spend more money. Maybe you just spend it on more expensive consultants. I don't know. But I mean, in general, they take security even more serious, and hopefully they're going to spend more efforts in making it more secure, and they're going to be more restrictive on how they deploy web services or web applications as part of their infrastructure. This was a web application that was built for a corporate challenge for employees that got utilized to get access to other systems.
Yeah, it's funny with those weaknesses. Did you hear about the shell shock vulnerability? Most of you guys did. It's a simple way you could even, through a web application, if you had access to bash through the application, or if you had direct access to bash through something else, you could, of course, run bash commands. That was the thing. So it was a very convenient way to execute code. And there was some interviews with the NSA in regards to shell shock. There was actually one NSA director that stated, like, this is an error in our processes, that this vulnerability existed without us knowing about it. That was something that was really, they were furious about it because something must have gone wrong. It couldn't have been that easy to exploit all these systems, and they didn't know about it. They didn't say that when Heartbleed came out and all those things. Food for thought.
So something that's not from the US, but from Sweden. I think many of you are from Sweden. And we actually published a report with a lot of efforts from Jimmy, our colleague. Is Jimmy here? Raise your hand. Oh, up there. So we published a report about hundreds of websites being hacked and new websites added each day. And this is actually something that's this is troublesome, that database dumps are being submitted to a Swedish internet forum, Flashback. And the database dumps, including credentials and sensitive user data, is just being submitted. So if you haven't done so already, I really recommend visiting that thread just to get an overview of how many websites that are actually being hacked. I hope it's not your website. Probably not. But still, it's websites being used. I would say it's websites being used by quite many of us.
And another thing that I think is worth mentioning, have you ever done any penetration test or check on a mobile application and found out that you could execute code remotely on it?
Yeah.
I think there is a perception like it has to be like a typical server-side like web in order to really break something. Mobile applications can be equally vulnerable. And they connect to servers. If you can get man in the middle and make them connect to you, you can sometimes run stuff on that system. So you need to widen your perspective many times and not think about the obvious that everybody's talking about. It's just code executing on a processor. If somebody can change the behavior, it's bad.
And I mean, we've done some analysis of this, but I mean, we're not following this in detail each day. But clearly, this is not advanced attacks. This is running readily available tools for download on the internet.
Yeah, this particular example.
These examples that I'm talking about.
Yeah, they're running a tool called SQL Map. You can just download it for free and enter some syntax and fire away. If they are vulnerable to common SQL injections.
So how many of you know what a SQL injection is? Yeah. So how many of you think that there are still SQL injections out there? Yeah.
How many of you would believe us if we say that in 70% of the cases when we do a DMZ pen test, we find at least one SQL injection? Yeah, half of you believe it. Interesting.
So
I wonder why I said it.
I don't know if we even need to ask ourselves, why is security and development so important? But there are threats. There are both targeted and generic threats. And when something like shell shock or heartbleed is discovered and being shown to the public, then everything is probed. Both internal services and services published on the internet. Internal services are being probed through clients. So client-side vulnerabilities are utilized to get access to the corporate networks. Typical targets could be basically anything that executes code. But most of the time it's application servers or client devices or client computers. And for sure, mistakes happen in your code, and even if your code is bulletproof, you use a lot of code, right? That you didn't write. You use code in your operating system that might have vulnerabilities. You download tons of dependencies when you build your giant Java enterprise application. Of course, there might be vulnerabilities in that code. There might even be... Yeah. Maven dependencies. I'm going to stop there because we're going to revisit that subject in a later session today. So, but good point.
Hang in there, your answer will come.
Yeah, it's definitely going to come. We have one of our engineers from TrueSec, Sebastian Olsson. He knows everything about this. So he's going to show this and he's going to demo how this works in practice. He's going to download dependencies from the internet by building.
And we call him the living Wikipedia, so we're kind of afraid that NSA is going to try to recruit him.
Sorry.
Just look how many of the breaches you mentioned already that were in open source supposed to be safe.
Yeah, I mean, that's a valid discussion. I think that's an interesting discussion that, of course, a lot of the vulnerabilities are in open source products or open source software, and which is claimed to be peer reviewed. And of course, it's peer reviewed quite a lot. But it doesn't necessarily mean that open source or closed source is better than the other.
And you also have to realize some things. Government agencies, they also contribute. There is actually a document that states that NSA has forced Google to implement some NSA written code into Android. Future versions of Android. You can find it on the web. It's a statement. They forced them to implement it. But they follow the open source program, so it's going to be some guy from some company that will just put the code in there the formal way and they're going to accept it. It's just going to be a contributor. It's not going to be NSA inserting this. It's going to be Hans Petersen from Denmark, doing this.
And of course, it also depends a lot on what kind of open source project we're talking about. I mean, if it's OpenSSL, that's being reviewed all the time. But still, there are vulnerabilities being discovered all the time. But there are also open source projects, I'm sure you've used some open source projects that are not being actively maintained. And of course, if there is a vulnerability in that code, then maybe no one cares about it. Even if you notify them about that vulnerability, they might not fix it.
This is a fun discussion. How many of you guys believe that closed source, like, what would be a good example? Microsoft operating system or Windows, would that be considered closed source? Yeah, that is closed source. That's like the definition of closed source. It could be maybe Apple that would be even more closed, if you will. How many non-Microsoftists do you think have access to the shared source program that Microsoft provides? Thousands. I am in that shared source program. I have Microsoft source code access because I'm a Microsoft MVP. Government agencies get it. Large corporations get it because they have to be compatible and understand how some of the communication works and stuff. So we have a smart card. We can log in from the internet to Microsoft's shared source program, and I can see the source code. I can't download the tree, but I can watch it in a web browser, so I can read the code. So it's also semi-open source, if you will. It's open to a lot of people.
Yeah, and one example of semi-open source is iOS or OS X. And there was a vulnerability discovered early this year called Go to Fail. Probably most of you heard about it, right? Yeah. And this affects iOS up to version 7.06. And with some exceptions, there were actually backported patches as well. And this was code being brought from iOS to OS X around the release of 10.9. So it actually affected 10.9.1 as well of OS X. If this would have been code that was shared even during the 10.8 version, then a lot more, or clearly a lot more Macs would have been affected by this too. And this is something that's really important. It's important, of course, to understand in general that developers make mistakes, but also the fact that if we as developers put all our trust in SSL or TLS, then our application data might be at risk if the users decide not to update their device. So just an extra go to fail statement caused all the certificate validation to fail or to accept all server certificates.
So even this is a big mistake or a very sophisticated way of hiding a vulnerability in there. Put go to fail in there twice, and you have a backdoor.
Yeah, some people think it's something that was hidden in the source code. I think it's more like a merge issue or something, that you accidentally made it be to go to fail. Of course, this shows a quite good example of how important it is to have brackets around single line statements as well. You're still awake.
And now we know they're developers, otherwise they wouldn't have left.
Exactly. So the question is SSL TLS enough? How do we detect our attacks or any attacks being performed on our systems? How do we prevent them? So what's going to be up to us and what's going to be enforced by government or by law? One thing's for sure, the software we create and the software we use is going to define the future. Isn't that great?
That's the final word for the keynote, right?
Yeah, it is. So I think now is a good time to have a break. We're going to go back here 20 minutes past 10. For a session about web security. And that's going to be Marcus, and it's going to be Fabio Vigiani, our Italian colleague.
The Italian, yeah.
Yeah.
The Italian geek. It can't be like the Rocky Marciano or whatever. Yeah.
So they're going to show, or most of the time, Fabio is going to demo quite good examples of stuff we find in web applications.
We can promote it more after the break. So
yes.
guys, thank you for this session.
Thank you.